It's a funny place to be, stuck in a seemingly mundane world with an inner knowing that the universe is so much more than our mortal minds can comprehend. Yet we all have the capacity to know peace and our oneness with the wholeness of life. And through these interviews, discussions, and reflections, it is my intention to share this possibility. I'm Ryan Kurzak, and this is the Kriya Yoga Podcast. Welcome back, everybody, to the Kriya Yoga Podcast. I'm here with a special guest today, Stuti Jha, who is a student in the Kriya Yoga Apprenticeship Program, our 2-year online course. And a while ago, I extended the invitation out to participants in that course who had some speaking experience and could keep their thoughts fairly organized to interview me for the Kriya Yoga podcast. That way, it's not just me always talking about stuff that I think is important, but bringing up some things that individuals walking the path, students of the path, things that they want to know about. So welcome, Stuti. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to interview you today.
No problem. I'm looking forward to it. So I know that you have a significant list of questions, so we'll see how we do with it.
Yeah.
So go ahead, start at the top, and let's see what you're curious about.
Okay, so these first set of questions are basically about life in current situation, and the first part is about atheism and spirituality. Mm-hmm. So I live near a big city, and most of my friends are atheists, or they don't believe in any formal religion. Mm-hmm. So and honestly, almost all of them are, in my opinion, living a yogic life. They're doing what one is supposed to do. They are not harming anyone. They're not hurting anyone. They are doing their work as honestly as possible. They're involved in charity. Now, my question is, does it make a difference that these people do not believe in God?
Right. Well, that's a good question. And the short answer to that is no, it doesn't make a difference for a few different reasons. Number one, God doesn't really care one way or the other whether people believe in him. And that doesn't really matter too much in the long run, because ultimately, many people think of God as a personal figure in the sky. And, as we begin to meditate and explore yoga practices and we evolve through it and mature, we start to recognize that what we have used as a concept of God is simply that. It's just a concept. We can relate to the powers of God through prayer and through mantra and through meditation. But ultimately, what we're aiming to do is simply realize what is the truth of this thing that we call God. And really, God is everything. That's what it boils down to. So whether or not someone believes in God or doesn't believe in God doesn't really matter. And what I have found is that, as you are seeing, people who are living an ethical life, people who are doing their best to do good work within the world, maintain positive connections with others, eating right, developing their mind and consciousness so that they're more mentally and psychologically healthy. What they find eventually is they have a sense of inner peace and wisdom and knowing just by doing that, and they don't have to call it God. And I can even recall one time Mr. Davis, during a talk at Center for Spiritual Awareness, he mentioned that the term that we have for God is actually a fairly recent invention. I could be wrong, but I believe he might have said around 600 AD? Anywhere, it's something recent that we've kind of come up with this word or this idea of God, and the term itself means, in a sense, the highest good. So this is a tricky question, because on one hand, a belief in God and understanding of God for some people helps to inspire them along the path, but ultimately belief doesn't really matter. It's kind of moving into that state of clarity that yoga is aiming for, and anyone who's living a good life will tend to come to that somehow.
Yeah, that was my thought too, because many of them are living a good life, and in the end, that's all we aspire for, all of us. So,
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
thank you. Thank you for answering that question.
No problem.
Okay, so let me move on to the next question because we have a long list. So,
Yes.
so the next part of this question is basically about activism and spirituality. And many of us have been disturbed by things that have happened in our society, not just in recent past, but over centuries. And we've seen a lot of protests and other kind of activism especially in the US in the last few weeks. Now, my question is that if a student of yours come to you and ask you that that's what they feel their calling is, that they want to be a part, they want to be an activist. So
Mhm.
what will be your advice to them? How can they reconcile the yogic path with their desire to be an activist?
Right. That is an ongoing debate in spirituality. I can remember reading a talk with Ramana Maharshi, and I believe an individual was brought up Gandhi, and
Mm,
he asked Ramana Maharshi, Ramana Maharshi, why aren't you doing what Gandhi does? Why aren't you out
mm,
there and fighting the good fight? And
mm,
Ramana Maharshi would indicate and say that the highest service that we can perform is that of our own self-realization. And I have I'm surrounded with many people who really care about the world.
right.
And my late wife Melissa, she was always very much interested in helping communities and in helping minorities where she could,
Mm,
raising children well. I mean, making sure that kids had what they need. She was very
mm,
much into that. Many of my friends, even one of the meditation groups up here,
mm,
uh, Jim Norton, he's a Methodist minister. I actually interviewed him on another podcast one
mm.
time, but he's been active his entire life. He's almost 80, and so he can remember the civil rights movement and all these sorts of things.
Okay.
And he also is very active.
Mm,
So I understand this desire and this drive. And the thing that I always wonder about, and when people ask me about this, I try to get to the heart of the matter about what is really inspiring them to want to take this up.
right.
Now, it makes sense that when there's injustice in the world, yes, we should all try somehow to
Mm,
correct that or work through that. But not everyone has the same kind of role.
mm,
So when it comes to being an activist or an individual who thinks they want to change the world, I always like to encourage people to stop and take a look at what is your real motivation. Is it because you have the skills, the capacity, and the passion and desire all together that you can effectively make a difference?
yeah.
Or is it that you're being triggered by whatever might have happened to you as a child psychologically, and you're just really reacting or responding from a place of like a psychological complex.
Mm-hmm.
um, and one of the students in the Kriya Yoga apprenticeship program who lives in town here with me, he's of African American descent. I asked him about this because he personally, from what
Mm,
I've gathered, doesn't really feel the need to go walk in protests or to uh,
right.
do a lot of what's going on. And I was like, okay, well, why is that? He says, Ryan, he's like, I've seen this happen again and again and again. He's like, some
Mm,
injustice occurs, and
mm,
then everyone gets up in arms, and then it
mm,
passes, and we're back to where we were, and it just keeps
yeah.
happening again and again.
Yeah.
And we discussed that and came to the somewhat mutual understanding that when there's injustice in the world, we need to do our best to speak up.
Right.
However, the best service we can render, like Ramana Maharshi says, is number one,
Mm,
to develop our own self-realization, and number two, to attend to our own spiritual practices, not simply the practices of meditation and just those sorts of things. But if an individual develops greater inner peace, and if an individual develops a greater sense of inner truth, then how they live their life impacts everyone around them silently.
Yeah.
In the same way that many people in my immediate family, I've heard them say all kinds of interesting, not quite politically correct, and sometimes I've heard them make jokes that made me go, "My God, is this really my family? Are they really saying this?"
No, even all of us have those kind of family members. So.
Yes, yes. And what I found was over the years is that if I'm interacting with them, if I challenge them, if I push them, they tend to get more entrenched in their belief and they push right back. But if I let them say what they're going to say, and I just sit there as peacefully as possible and let it in a sense process, and they see that there's no reaction on my part, what happens eventually is they come around and they say, "Well, what do you think about this?" And they ask it sincerely. And then I explain my position from a yogic point of view about harmlessness, truthfulness, and it makes them stop and kind of question how they've been thinking.
Right.
And I've seen over the years that they've become less and less they've become less and less sort of part of the problem.
Belligerent.
Yes.
Okay.
And it even made them start thinking about, well, what about the people I hang around? I mean, meaning themselves. Maybe they don't quite have the right idea. So there's a few levels to this. Number one, if a person has the skills, the capacity, and the energy to make a difference, then activism, if it's part of their dharma and their path, wonderful. But I do encourage people to stop and take a step back and say, is it really because that is part of your path and because you have the capacity to help there? Or is it because you are just so reactionary to it that you just want to respond, you want to retaliate in a way?
Right.
Because retaliation, the other day, I'm not sure if you were you on the call last night?
Yes, I was. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Well, before we got on to a topic, the questions, I mentioned how I was
The mask.
I was in a grocery store, and I went to this grocery store because usually it's pretty quiet. People seem to be pretty nice there. And I noticed that a couple of the employees, they were wearing a mask, but they were wearing it down so that their nose was showing. And I thought to myself, do they understand how a mask works? And I thought, well, I'm going to bring it up to them. And first I brought it up to someone who was wearing a mask. I said, hey, have you thought about asking your coworkers if they know how to wear a mask, like how it works? And he said, and this was an elderly man. He said, I know. He's like, but they just don't listen. And so I thought, well, I'm going to ask them. And I knew, after seeing many viral videos of people being angry and belligerent, I knew that coming up to them and saying, are you stupid? Why aren't you wearing the mask right? I knew that wasn't going to work. Because essentially, violence makes stupid even stupider, usually.
Right. Yes. Agree.
Yes. And so I walked up to this one woman and I said, hey, do you know how that mask works? And she looked at me and then she turned her back on me. And I thought, oh, okay. And so I went into a description. I said, look, I was like, a while ago, I had to wear a mask for about 12 hours a day because my wife was going through leukemia treatments and her immune system was next to nothing. So if she got any kind of disease or minor cold, she would die. And it's important to protect people. And the whole time I'm saying it just like I said to you. And she keeps turning away from me when walking away. And, maybe it didn't make any difference.
Yeah.
But maybe it planted a seed.
That's true. Yes.
And even as I was walking around the store, I thought about it. And when I saw workers who were wearing masks correctly, I said, thank you for wearing your mask correctly. And I explained the leukemia story and said, this is why it's important. So maybe that will start to change the culture a little bit.
Yeah.
But again, going back to this yogic ideal that Ramana Maharshi puts forth, that self-realization is your highest service to the world. It's because when you are established in the self and you are calm and content and peaceful and truthful inside, you are going to respond appropriately in a given situation.
Right. No,
Which,
that is true. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, that's okay. Which simply means that, for example, if you see an injustice being done and you are calm and you know how to react, you will respond in a much more effective fashion than if you just get all riled up. But there also might be times where, for example, like with the masks or dealing with family members, if you are established in your self-realization and you think about saying something to them and you know it's either going to start more of a fight or get them more entrenched into their beliefs rather than being effective in having a conversation and working it out, simply to be quiet and let your own presence be what is transformational. This is a very controversial topic, I think, in spiritual circles, but to answer your question, this is how I would approach it.
Right. No, as we're talking, I was thinking about this Indian activist called Anna Hazare, and he's a great leader. He has been able to move masses for different causes. And just by the way he talks and the way he is, he looks like a very spiritual man. He looks very peaceful and calm. He believes in nonviolence. So I understand there is a role, as you said, but again, understanding the background, the motivation is very important.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that.
Right. It also overflows to other things too, such as simply the desire or the compulsion to want to help.
Right.
And I've seen this being a Kriya yoga teacher and also being involved as a massage therapist, craniosacral therapist in healing fields, and teaching people really is what I've noticed, where I've noticed it most, where people come to a healing profession not because they really have a motivation that's they want to learn something, a skill, so that they can be effective for others. Many people come to healing professions because they're hurting. And they think that if they help enough people, they'll stop hurting. I see it very rarely. Have I met a healer or someone involved in the healing field that really did it just because it was truly their dharma, because they had an interest in it and they wanted to attend to it. The same is true for people interested in being a spiritual teacher, and I know we're going to get to a question about that. Many people who they want to be spiritual teachers, they want to help other people, teach others yoga and meditation, and oftentimes it's not because they simply have that as their dharma and as part of their path and purpose where they're going to be good at it because they've got the skills and they're set up to do that, but it's because deep down inside they want to help others because they still don't quite feel good about themselves in a way. Does this make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, it does. And for everyone, mostly people listening to this, majority of people listening to this, probably we all started our spiritual path because we were unhappy or hurting in some way or the other. So yeah, all of us, we do understand this.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that is why, again, going back to Ramana Maharshi's idea that self-realization is the highest service, is because the clearer you get, the more you become aware of your little psychological complexes and whether you're really doing it because, if someone wants to be a doctor, are they really doing it because they just love anatomy and they just love the idea of cutting out tumors on people all day? Or are they doing it because they're motivated by this need to think that they're only worthy if they can help other people? Or they're doing it because they want to make a lot of money? If you've worked on your self-realization, your own inner work, you become very clear on the fact of, oh, well, these are my skills, and this is really where I can be of service, and it's not going to be directed by or inspired by compulsions. It'll be inspired by true inspiration. So I think that can be applied across the board to activism, to the work you do, to helping people, to any choice that you make, really.
Yeah. No, that's a great answer. Thank you, and I'm glad that you brought up self-realization, the idea of self-realization, because my next question is about that. And basically, it was the first lecture of the Kriya of the first year of Kriya Yoga apprenticeship program. You asked us that, what do you think self-realization is. What are your thoughts of self-realization? That was a question that you asked us. So I want to, turn the tables and ask you the same question, and also whether this definition of yours has evolved over time.
Yes. Well, before I answer that, let me ask you, how did you respond to that question?
I should have been prepared.
That's okay. If you don't.
No, I mean, self-realization. We just did the homework on this. So,
if you need me to pause it so you can go get into your email and check, we can do that.
No, I think I can talk.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So I think it's knowing that we are not our body, we are not our mind, and there is much more to life than just being bogged down by, the day-to-day affairs of life, which is very important, but then it's much more than that. And,
right.
Consciousness, of course, lives on forever. Mm-hmm. So realizing that this is not who you are, and your true identity, if there is any, is completely different. So.
Right. Well, good. Okay. So to answer the second part of your question, has your definition changed over time? Yes, my definition has changed over time. And hopefully everyone's definition will change over time, because we are growing. And when we first start on the path, we start and we have an idea of what it means. When I first started way back, what I thought self-realization meant was that I would have a constant, all the time feeling of bliss, where I knew I was one with everything. And if I was walking down the street and I saw someone walking towards me, since I knew I was one with everything, I could almost even feel their body walking, because we're all one.
Yeah.
So I had this really fantastic idea of what self-realization was supposed to be like. And that was okay, because it helped to keep inspiring me along the way. But as time passed, I began to study more and meditate more deeply and more effectively. I always went back to, in a sense, what is defined in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. In the very beginning, when it's described that samadhi or yoga is experienced when the fluctuations and changes in the meditator's awareness are restrained and pacified. Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. And in the beginning, even when I first started reading that and understanding that, what I thought was everything stops, meaning nothing is happening in a way. And I strove to achieve that for a while. And then eventually it became clear to me that these fluctuations and the changes in the meditator's awareness, what they really are the definitions and concepts that we have. For example, I'm trying my best to explain this with words, and that's the other thing I've learned about self-realization, is that it can't be explained with words. But it's like as if we are walking down the road, and most people are thinking all the time. They're saying, oh, look, the tree is moving because the wind's blowing. I've got bills to pay. Someone's coming down the street. They look kind of scary. Or look, that person looks like my grandmother. They must be a sweetheart. Like all these things that go through the mind. And those are the fluctuations and changes which are rising and falling. And when a person abides as the self, experiences the self, again, the best way I know words to describe it, it's moving back so far back into that witnessing presence that there is no longer an attachment to definitions. It's pure experiencing. And that can happen while your eyes are open and you're walking around and you're engaged in the world, pure experiencing. But what most people compare it to or relate it to is those moments of pure experiencing, pure awareness, when your eyes are closed and your awareness is turned within and you are aware of nothing else other than pure existence being, as Mr. Davis would say, my Kriya yoga teacher. So what I have come to understand that self-realization means is being and abiding as that self, which is essentially pure existence being. And that can happen in meditation. That can happen right now when we're having this conversation. That can happen at any time. But it's all about being that awareness. Because many people say, well, what does the self look like? Or how do you see the self? And you can't see the self. You can only be the self. Just like as what's his name, Alan Watts. Alan Watts would say, you can't bite your own teeth.
Yeah.
Unless there's a mirror around, you can't see your own eyeballs. So the self, you can only be the self. And it's when we've meditated well enough and we've lived a life organizing our nervous system, our situations such that we're able to finally exist and experience that pure existence being. And at first, usually, it's in deep meditation that we catch a glimpse of it. It's always there. It's always there. But then we start to experiment with, how is it maintained even when it seems like the body is moving and the lips are talking and the wind is blowing, and it eventually begins to encompass every experience. And then even then it goes even further to where a person can be and act just like everybody else. They can still demonstrate anger. They can still demonstrate love, but inside they are aware of what they truly are, and they're not defined by it. They're not pulled into it. Does this make sense, what I'm trying to share?
It does. Yes, absolutely. I just have a follow-up question. You remember the first time you had that realization? When was it?
It was March 22nd.
Sorry, what?
No, I don't. I was making a joke. I was going to give you the exact date. Okay, I can remember one of the most vivid times that it became clear to me. In a way, whenever I would go to CSA and meet with Mr. Davis at the retreats, and then of course come home and meditate on my own and continue life as it was, I always knew that these words, like what I'm trying to describe, the way he described it, I always knew that they were true. And what I found fascinating was, it was probably about 5 years after I first met Mr. Davis and was initiated, and it was right after I was ordained as a Kriya Yoga teacher, that I had this understanding. But then one day, I was to drive down about 2 hours from my home to a Unity Church in Charleston, West Virginia, and give my very first talk on Kriya Yoga and meditation in a church setting. And I can remember going down there, and I can remember giving the talk, and I can remember feeling inspired because there was also a Kriya Yoga initiation service that followed that. It was a wonderful time. But then as I was driving home, I had to stop for gas. And I stopped in this little town, and this was in the middle of West Virginia, where the population was probably less than 100 in this little town. And the gas station was run down. The bathroom smelled terrible. But I went and I started pumping gas. And as soon as I started pumping gas, I just happened to look up, and I saw the clouds and how they were moving. And everything became silent. Everything became just pure experience beyond anything I'd ever had realization I'd happened at that point. And there was not even a mind to say, oh, that's interesting. It was expansive. And I did chuckle to myself because, here I am at a gas station that looks terrible and smells bad. And it's not like I was just back teaching or I was deep in meditation. It was this experience, and everything became perfect and crystalline and clear. And it persisted for quite a while after that. And I began to remember after that point moments when I was a teenager and when I was a child, when I experienced that. It was like I couldn't relate to it. I didn't remember it, But after I'd had that experience, I began to remember every other time when that happened, which was amazing. Mm. And the reason I consider that's the case is because there's no mind going on. There's no thoughts. There's nothing to remember. It's not like, something major happens and you can define it and say this, and that. It's just, it's beyond concepts. So the mind really can't remember things beyond concepts. Right. But that's a beautiful thing. And it's described in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali too, mm-hmm. is that as you have moments of samadhi or realization, that those leave a positive impression in the mind. Mm-hmm. And in time, the more you have those, the more you start to realize just how common they actually are. Mm-hmm. So I guess that would probably be around maybe July or August of 2005, I think, when I first remember that kind of experience. And then, of course, as I said, I remembered all the other ones I had previously. So it was interesting.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you so much.
No problem.
Okay, so we're done with the first set of questions. So let's move on to our next topic, which is on death. Okay. So basically, that's my point of entry in spiritualism. That's why I'm fascinated. I've always been fascinated by death. And I started watching all these videos on near-death experiences around 2.5 years ago. And that led to a chain reaction. And then eventually I found Kriya Yoga. Mm-hmm. And recently I got to know that even you've been interested in learning more about near-death experiences, and I just wanted to and I know neither of us are experiencers or have any kind of expertise on the matter, but I just wanted to know your opinion on the experiences that you have heard about or read in various books. How does it, how much of it resonates with you as a yogi?
Yes. Well, a lot of it does. And you're right. As far as I can remember, I don't recall ever having a near-death experience. I did almost drown one time, but other than that, I don't remember that being a near-death experience. I just remember being a kid and looking up from the bottom of the river and seeing my uncle up there and seeing him reach down and grab my hair and pull me up out of the water. But anyway, I became interested I've always been interested in it because part of the process of yoga and even Kriya Yoga is there's a technique called Yoni Mudra or Jyoti Mudra.
Yes.
And that is the practice of learning to see the inner light in the spiritual eye. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Davis would always describe Yoni Mudra as Yoni means like the birth canal. So physically, it's like the birth canal. Mm-hmm. But in this context, it represents the birth canal through which we are born into higher awareness. Mm. And when I would have those experiences doing that technique, I always would remember how people described that when they had a near-death experience, they would see a radiant light that they would go through. Mm. And so early on, I always had the sense that what we're doing is we are essentially dying in meditation, and we're learning how to go through that light consciously. And even I believe in the Bible, I think Jesus says to die daily, or maybe it's one of the apostles, I'm not sure. But one of them says to die daily. And that is what started my first interest in this, because I've also always been interested in altered states of consciousness other than just normally how we experience the world. But as you know, and as many people know, my wife was suddenly diagnosed with an extremely aggressive form of leukemia after being a vegetarian, a yogi, living probably the most pristine life possible. And that really puts in your face the idea of facing death. Even though it wasn't my own, it was watching someone who had been part of my life for more than half of my life since I was 16 years old. Mm-hmm. And I began to watch videos or see discussions on near-death experiences. And even in the Kriya Yoga apprenticeship program, believe, I don't remember if it's year 1 or year 2, but one of them, I require that students watch the video by a fellow named, I believe it's Peter Fenwick, maybe it's Peter Fenwick, but I think
I think you talked about it in one of the Q&A, and yeah, I'd watched that video. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so this fellow who, I don't know if he's still alive, but he was a researcher, he was a psychologist, and also I believe he was a scientist related to neurology or neuroscience.
Yes.
And he had an extreme fascination with dying, near-death experiences. And so the video I think I recommended people watch was called Dying Well, which might be a TED Talk. But anyway, if you want to look that up, it's a wonderful...
I think I watched it, that one.
Yeah, it's a wonderful discussion.
Yeah.
And the reason I wanted them to watch it is because essentially when he describes dying well, it almost mirrors the process of practicing yoga. Because it's all about letting go of your attachments. It's all about letting go of that small sense of self and who you think you are. And so what I've come to understand is that near-death experience is the process of dying and dying well. It perfectly mirrors essentially what yogis are trying to do or doing consciously with their work, with their yogic practices. They're learning to do that. And they're learning to live those principles of not being attached to their mind, their body, their small sense of self. It doesn't mean that they don't still take care of their body or they still don't act in the world. The key is not being attached to it. So to answer your question, personally, I think a study of near-death experiences, a study of death in general, of dying well, that really aligns perfectly with yogic philosophy, because essentially what we're doing as yogis, and even as Mr. Davis would say, we're learning to let go of the small sense of self. And that is the biggest obstacle that gets in our way of realizing what is true. It's identification and attachment to this little personality that we think is so important. And if we can let go of that, then we're able to experience this clearer, greater, grander consciousness of which we are really all a part.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I also watched this TED Talk by Amita Moorjani, I forgot.
Yes.
So, that's one of the most popular TED Talks on near-death experiences. And she talks about the same thing, right? That when we are in the physical body, it feels like we have a horse's view. We can only see things from one perspective.
Right.
And then when you are out there, in her experience, the whole universe was like, she was aware of everything around her. So it was not, she was not bound by her physical body. So all of that also is quite what we study, right? And what we aim to achieve someday. I don't know.
Right, and bringing Anita Moorjani up, that's a good point, because the other thing that's worth learning about near-death experiences and even people who are dying, and since I watched Melissa die and I was there when it happened, one of the key functions that I have seen that happens as people get closer to death, or at least I've only watched one or two personally, but even in Anita Moorjani's case and a few others, what they all seem to come to is that what is so important in this world, what is of ultimate importance in this world is number one, well, it's not really numbered, but we'll just say number one, living without fear.
Yes.
Living without fear. And number two, giving more love. Mm-hmm. And I can remember as Melissa was on her way out the last 7 weeks, as her body got weaker and weaker and she couldn't walk anymore and these sorts of things, she was still radiant inside. And she went and she bought T-shirts for all of her friends that simply just said love on it. And she was all about the most important thing that we're here to do is to love one another, to exist in a state of love. And Anita Moorjani talks about that. Many other people I've studied who died and came back, they've described that love is what it's all about. And so not only is it supportive in regards to letting go of attachments and learning to live freely, but it's learning to live, doing whatever it takes to live without fear, which is one of the reasons why, for example, in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the practice of yoga, Kriya yoga, is one of the practices is surrender in God. Because if you are surrendered in God, you have faith, and you are not living in fear.
Yes.
And people have to, if they want to do this well, they have to find a way to do that. If they're eating their vegetables and they're exercising, they're being kind to their kids and their loved ones and their friends, and they are giving more love, but they can't quite surrender, or they don't have the faith to trust in life, because life is still going to steamroll you every now and then. And part of having the faith and the trust and surrender in God isn't, I'm going to surrender and trust as long as things are going well. It's, I'm going to surrender and trust, period.
Yeah.
And so a person is practicing yoga, is practicing Kriya, if they are actively figuring out, working on ways to live like that. And if they can, probably dying won't be so difficult. Their life will be much better. They will be embodying these yogic teachings. So near-death experiences, dying, about letting go of attachments, giving more love, learning to actually have faith and surrender. All this, I believe, comes out in through the study of near-death experiences, but also watching and observing people who have died well and the experiences they have had.
No, yeah, that's absolutely true. And there's so much to learn just by reading or watching these people talk about their experiences. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about life and what is important in life, and where we should be, where our energies and our attention should be focused. All of those things. So yeah, I agree with everything that you said.
Yes.
Is there anything that you thought was contrary to what your experience has been as a yogi?
I have to say, no, not really. Because the practices of meditation themselves are, in a sense, it's like simulating. If you do it right, it's like simulating the death process. Now, people might take that just because of misunderstanding or not really having different definition of words and ideas, but the meditative experience is really about letting go of this small sense of self, as we mentioned, and that can be painful and scary for some people. But the more we do it well, and the more we kind of see it that well, and we look at it more of instead of being like, no, I don't want to do that, that's too scary, saying, you know what, that's scary, but I know this is part of the path, so I'm going to walk through it, and I'm going to come out the other side and see what happens. So I have found that really the processes of meditation, the way that a yogi is indicated to live, say through the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and so on. No, I really think that an understanding of death, trying to understand death at least, because I don't think it's understandable, but trying to understand death and respect it and honor it and see it as a part of life and a part of God as well. I have not seen anything contrary to that, to the yogic teachings.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And you've already talked about it from your own meditation experience, but I wanted to talk about this study that was published in a scientific journal. And it talks about how in a longitudinal study, they found that Buddhist meditators, Buddhist monks, they can induce near-death experiences at a pre-planned point in time. And they can actually get into NDE experience anytime they want. So what are your thoughts about? Do you think that's, and they found it, so it is possible, but what are your thoughts on this?
Well, what's being described here in the study that you mentioned, and I'm just going to, the title of it was Meditation Induced Near-Death Experiences, a 3-year longitudinal study, right?
Yes.
Yeah, by William Van Gordon and a whole host of other people.
Yes.
Basically, yes, that's when you read an autobiography of Yogi, and you read about experiences that Yogananda is having, when you read about these yogis going into blissful states, well, that's what they're doing, because you can't experience what's called samadhi or oneness while you are still identified with this little personality. So what they're describing in this study, what the Buddhists are describing as near-death experiences and so on, that would be the same thing that that a yogi would say he or she is experiencing when they have utterly and completely let go of attachment to the small sense of self and have freed their awareness into that state of pure consciousness. So yes, it's completely possible. It's completely normal. So if we're looking at it that way, then you asked me if I had experienced near-death experiences. I guess I'm going to say yes now, because that's again, the meditation process. If it's done right, that's what happens. That's why through the Kriya Yoga practices, you do supportive practices, and then you conclude with that yoni mudra, because then you train yourself to see that light and then to go in and go through that light. And that is what happens when a person has a near-death experience. So the short answer to that question is simply, that doesn't surprise me at all. And yes, if we do our practices well and we really get in there and become skillful at it, sure, we can learn how to experience that all the time, which is why it is possible that people who've been practicing yoga for a long time don't necessarily truly fear death.
Yeah.
Because they've done it so many times already. There still might be a little attachment they have to shake, but that passes very quickly from what I understand. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me. And it may be then, now that we're talking about it, that people who've become very skillful at least the Kriya practices as I know them and can flow their awareness through the spiritual eye center and see that inner light, then they're probably, yes, achieving near-death experiences in that way.
Yeah, now that makes sense. And I mean, the comparison between, like, the comparison that you made between, the Jyoti Mudra, where you see the light in the spiritual eye, and a lot of these experiences talking about seeing a light and moving through a tunnel of light. And that makes sense now, actually. I never put those two things together. So, yeah.
Yes.
And the next question is actually, you've already answered it partially, which is basically, should we be talking about the way death is perceived in our society? So
Yes.
but yeah, if you have anything more to add to that.
Well, now that I think about it, you are the second student in the Kriya Yoga apprenticeship program to take me up on the offer of doing this podcast and interviewing me. And Mitch Hankins was the first one, and I kind of remember him also talking about this stuff. So it's making me wonder why it keeps coming up. But to be clear, yes. I do really, truly feel that a change in the perception of death would really help out so much in our society and in our culture. Because I've thought about this a lot. Again, up until Melissa got sick, I didn't really think about it a whole lot. I'd experienced the loss of elderly family and friends, but in my mind it was just, well, they're old, so of course of course the body is meant to die and go. But when Melissa died, she was maybe 42. I think she was 42, and very young and vibrant and still had a lot of life in her. And it made me realize that death is everywhere and can happen at any time to anyone. And what we do in our culture now is we have science such that we can avoid seeing and experiencing death. For many people, we can go a long time without really having to face it. And when you don't have to face death, when you haven't seen death, when you haven't really contemplated death or been forced down that road, you live life very differently. And now that I have personally faced it and experienced it in my life, I realize just how much more precious it makes life. I have realized just how much more important it makes every moment in life. And this comes back to an idea. People have asked, at least one student asked me before, how can one be in relationships and love without attachment? because we think of love as, oh, I'll never be without you. We'll always be together, and those sorts of things. But and I was that way, so I had to face that, and it taught me that by facing death, you begin to realize that all love is important, and that the type of love that is most important is the love that is free. Meaning, when you are in a relationship with someone, or you are doing something, you are loving, you are doing that thing, you are experiencing that, not for anything you hope to get out of it in the future. Not because you think that you've got another 40 years together, and so you're doing whatever you're doing, but you can love someone and not expect anything from them, and that becomes a free kind of love, in that you're there, you're present, you are maintaining a relationship respectfully, so you're not just being irresponsible or thinking that you just give free love to everybody. That's not what I mean. But you realize that you are loving them right now, and the time may come when they're not around anymore, or they may die, they may move on, you may change, but it's okay. You're able to let that go, because you know that love is eternal and exists in all things and all people. So other circumstances, other situations will arise where love is present. And what I found personally is that by facing death in this way, that I began to see that, for example, what I found so important about my relationship with Melissa, the love there, is it comes through any way it can. Meaning, when I had that time from 16 to, I don't know, what was it, 30, 39 or somewhere like that with Melissa, and I thought she was the love of my life, that's all there ever was. And of course, I had to go through a year and a half, 2-year period of time of feeling like I was utterly torn in two, and I had no idea how I was still alive after experiencing that. But I began to see, if I paid attention, that people would show up in my life, and it was almost as if that love that I knew in Melissa was here again. But it was because what was real was the love. It wasn't what I identified with the body of Melissa and the personality of Melissa. It was simply the love. And so if we're able to change our perception of death in our culture, if we can embrace it, I've said this before, in Hindu traditions, there are gods of death. There are gods and goddesses of destruction.
Yes. And
all the gods and goddesses in the Hindu religion, hopefully I'm talking about this correctly, they can be seen as separate entities, but really, ultimately, they are simply powers of the one whole force, presence, being, the ultimate God, however you want to describe it. And so what that means is that death and change and pain and illness is also God. And if we are able to see that even those things that we can't even think that our little personality could withstand or bear, if we can accept that as God too, well, then we become whole. So in my mind, if we changed our perception of death, if we learned to embrace death, to see it for what it is, and quit trying to always maintain this positive view of life, or this idea that life always has to be good and always has to be perfect in the way that we want it to be, we would become whole. And then as we go through our lives, we probably wouldn't even really be talking so much about self-realization and all this, because we would already be whole. We would already know that everything that happens is one whole experience, life, God, and that is beyond the mind. That is the totality of it all. So I think that it's very important to, if we can, find some way to contemplate this. It would also even change the way we live our lives. I haven't talked about this very much with too many people, but after going through the experience that I did, and early on in my life having had difficulties with things like depression and anxiety, and having a view of life that was a little different than many people, I remember reading a study. What was this study? No, I'm sorry. I remember reading about a psychologist, and I believe this was a long time ago, but he was a psychologist, and when clients would come to him, one of the first questions he would ask them was, if they were sad or depressed or felt suicidal, he would say, well, why don't you kill yourself? Not in the morbid way, like sarcastic, but he would say, for what reason? Why are you still alive? What is your reason to be alive? Why haven't you done it yet? And because that would help to direct them to what was important in life.
Right.
And I thought about that a lot after, sort of grieving Melissa and continuing to meditate and do my practices and study. And I heard someone else talking one time, and this was more recent, it might have been on a radio show. They were talking about working with people who had suicidal thoughts. And they said, look, this is how I work with people. When someone had suicidal thoughts, what I would ask them, what I would say is, okay, so today you're feeling suicidal. So today, if there's anything at all that you would want to do that would keep you from killing yourself, what would that be? Like something you would enjoy doing or something you feel like you needed to do. And the person, well, yeah, all right. So rather than thinking about killing myself, you know what, I'm going to go do this thing. And what this stimulated in my mind was this whole idea about death, is that if we had a choice between dying, being dead, or killing ourselves or something, or doing something that supported us, that brought us alive, that brought us into joy again, choose that. And if people kind of had that dichotomy in their mind, and instead of being dead all day long, in the sense of many people are just caught in a rut and they're miserable and they don't know how to get out of it, and they don't realize that there's an option there. You can choose to do something that really brings life to you. And this is kind of a convoluted discussion I know that we're having. We've gone off and on.
No, I understand it totally. I mean, I almost think the same way, but yeah, probably, I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. So if people are not feeling good, or if they're really on some level feeling like, life isn't worth it, well, then they need to ask themselves, all right, well, why aren't I killing myself? And hopefully they'll find a reason, because it's not in any way to engender or encourage suicide.
No. I work in higher education. I know exactly how it's a big problem. Suicide among our young
Right.
Men especially. It's a big issue, and if we understand all these things and we can talk to them and in a way that they relate and understand and focus on things that are important to them, we may be able to save lives in that way. So I totally understand that. So
and it comes down to, really, what's the problem with that? Because why do people commit suicide? Because they don't think they have any other options. But what if they had the option of, oh, you mean I can just go do something that I want to do, or that I'm inspired to do? When the other option is death, well, then yes, you go do the thing which you are inspired to do.
No, I totally understand that part. And
yeah, and so I think that if more people really thought about it, again, seriously, and with a sense of wisdom and attention and respect and honor, that they might find that their life becomes more alive. They find that they don't have to do all these things. And even the book I was talking about last night, Cured, by I think it was Jeffrey Redinger. It's a book about people who had spontaneous remissions from very serious illnesses. And one of the things that he describes in that book is that they were faced with death. And they decided that rather than go through a lot of these really difficult treatments, that rather than go through them, they knew they had a certain amount of time left. And so they were just going to do what they wanted to do that was a meaningful life for them. Not what their parents thought they should do, not what their spouses thought they should do, not what their children thought they should do, not what anyone else thought they should do, but what would make their final days the most meaningful. And that was actually one of the components or variables within them having a spontaneous remission, is that once they started being in love again with life, they healed.
Yeah.
And so, and this is part of the yogic path, and it's even spoke of in the Bible. When Jesus says, let go of your family and all this other stuff, and you have to let go of all that to follow me. And if we want to be alive, we have to let go of all those attachments, all that bullshit, all those obligations that we think we have to all these people or others, and really pursue what is true for us, whether that's our spiritual path, whether that's our own dharma, our own passion, or whether it's just a hobby that we are thoroughly engrossed in. That is where we're going to find life. And sometimes it requires facing death or exploring death or coming to terms with death before we can really even give ourselves the permission to do that. So why not do it now rather than wait until we're backed into a corner and we have to make that choice?
Yeah.
So I think yes, the perception of death in our culture, it would encourage us to really truly live a life that was meaningful for us. It would make the most of every single moment, and we would find a way to be here now.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. Totally.
How that happens, I don't know, but that's
what we are here to find out. I mean,
yes, that's something.
Yes.
Yes, it's something we all have to figure out on our own, one way or the other, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so thank you, Ryan, and then we move on to the next set of questions.
This episode of the Kriya Yoga podcast was made possible by donations from Kriya Yoga apprenticeship students and supporters of our Patreon community at www.patreon.com/Kriya Yoga.